My name is Rosana Cruz. I live in New Orleans, Louisiana, and I'm the Associate Director of VOTE, Voice of the Ex-Offender. And I'm also on the board of Women with a Vision, which is an organization that promotes health and wellness and power and self-determination around sexual freedom and reproductive health. So as part of my work with Women with a Vision, um, I became involved in this campaign to end the practice of charging and imprisoning people for crime against nature, which is a 200-year statute in the state of Louisiana, which um, makes it a felony to solicit and not necessarily execute, but just to solicit um, oral or anal intercourse for money. And so the solicitation of crime against nature, we abbreviate it and call it SCAN, carries a penalty or carried a penalty of force, among other things. You did jail time, and you were also forced to register as a sex offender, which could extend for a long number of years after the end of your incarceration. So this had a number of collateral consequences for primarily the women. It was like majority women women of color who get charged with this, and it was something that we saw as a really detrimental and discriminatory statute that impacted women in a way that had really far-reaching effects into the rest of the community, right? So like has a negative impact on women, really like polices their movement, and was a way to kind of like up the ante, whereas women would normally, who were in the sex trade, would normally get charged with solicitation, which just is a misdemeanor and carries a very small penalty, and sometimes you can get out of it without doing jail time. The crime against nature was something that was used specifically to target not only women of color who were in the sex trade, but primarily people who were living on the street, like actually just the most vulnerable populations, right? So queer and trans people, folks who were like either homeless or just like borderline living situations, and just really increased the risk of being in vulnerable situations where they're more likely to engage in things that ended up causing HIV. So, or just other kind of like, you're more likely to end up in situations where you're subject to violence, to police harassment and brutality. It just like spreads out. And so the campaign that we started around SCAN has a number of different aspects, but the thing that I want to talk about most, because I feel like it's really relevant to kind of the intersections of the work that I do, is the ways in which it really policed the movement and limited the freedom of movement of women of color. And when I say women of color, I include all women, including trans women and non-gender conforming folks who may part-time identify as women. And so the challenge here is that this is like something that gives the police then authority to kind of assign deviant behavior to specific groups of people, and then increase the impact that being in the sex trade would have on a person. So it really, like the awareness that we had to raise around just identity and the like increased impact that this had on queer and trans folk and women who are in more vulnerable situations was really challenging, because a lot of the folks who provide advocacy and who do work around women's health were not necessarily looking at these intersections and looking at the specific, more ramped up impact that SCAN had on, for example, queer youth. And so the beautiful thing about the campaign has been the folks who have kind of taken leadership and ownership, and I think that, like, especially um, talking about being a sex worker is something that's really challenging and something that, like, people don't feel comfortable being public about. And I know personally, like, it's something about that invisibility that's really inhibiting in terms of when you're trying to do justice work and stand up for yourself. So the process of starting this campaign and having people who feel marginalized come out of the shadows, whether it was because we're sex workers or we're people of color who are discriminated against because we live in certain communities, or because we've grown up in low-income situations where we're used to, like, being made invisible, or because we're queer, or because you know, we make our living in a way that is part of the underground economy. All of these different factors, which, you know, we have varying limited amounts of control over, really added to that sense of being invisible and not feeling comfortable standing up for ourselves, because it was, like, risky. And so to watch women who were being targeted by SCAN kind of come into the light and stand up for themselves and say, actually, like, what is being done to me is wrong, and I'm a person and I deserve to, like, be able to speak for myself and stand up for myself, is probably one of the most powerful things about the campaign, and really, to me, the most beneficial in terms of, like, learning about ways in which organizing work can have these kind of residual, or, like, I don't want to say auxiliary because it's not that it isn't central, but, like, there's this other thing besides, like, we change the legislation or we win this lawsuit. You know, it's like we also, like, invite people to accept their personhood and to, like, become actualized within that and feel powerful. And that, to me, is one of the most beautiful and powerful things, and really inspiring for me as a person who, like, I myself have felt like I've lived in, you know, marginalized spaces and felt like I couldn't stand up for myself for whatever reason, you know.
That could have been